a lifelong collaboration between the husband and wife who've been married for 58 years. Daniel Boorstin is the author of many books, including The Creators, The Discoverers, and The Seekers. He is also a former Librarian of Congress. Ruth Boorstin edited all her husband's books and has just published a book of poetry titled Love Is Not Because. The interview takes place at their home in Washington, D.C.
Ruth Boorstin and Dr. Daniel Boorstin, nearly 60 years of marriage and professional collaboration. If you had to put your finger on what makes it work for the two of you, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, number one, being in love with the person so that everything he does has special meaning to you. And also, I think one very great help is being polite with each other always and appreciative and not taking things for granted and not trying to change things you're not going to be able to change.
Dr. Boorstin?
Well, I have nothing to add to Ruth's formula. I think it's a good formula to be able to work together, and I'm very lucky. I consider Ruth to be the luck of my life, which is a way of describing good fortune and also what has made it possible for me to have my works edited. If it hadn't been for Ruth, my books would have been twice as long and half as readable. I'm sure of that. So it's been very good fortune. I met Ruth by accident, really, many years ago when her brother, Bennett Frankel, who was one of the brightest students at the Harvard Law School where I was teaching, asked me if during Christmas vacation I'd like to meet his sister. I said, sure, bring her along. So that Christmas time when I was in New York, I met Ruth. That was on Christmas Day, and we married on April 9th.
And that seemed like a very long time to me. I don't know what he was waiting for. After a week, it was perfectly apparent. So since we met Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, I thought he could propose to me. But he was very cautious and waited a month. And then we got married in spring vacation, sort of an academic romance.
4 months, though. Are you both that decisive in your lives generally?
I was even more decisive. When I just saw Dan come through the door, I knew that was it. And
wow.
He took me to a modern dance program, which I thought was a very cultural thing to do. And when we were there, one of his friends took a thread off his coat, and I thought, oh, if I could only know him well enough to take a thread off his coat. So I did.
Well, but being a writer, you know, is making an infinite number of decisions and being willing to make them speedily and again. So in writing my major works, which have been long conceived and extended over many years, I have started by making the decision to write a work on a major subject, and then done it volume by volume. So I've written 2 trilogies, as you know, the 3 volumes of The Americans, the colonial experience, the national experience, and the democratic experience. And after that, I thought it might be a good idea to try to write a world history. And that became a history of not of wars and empires, which what most world histories are, but rather a history of human fulfillment. And that became the 3 volumes, which have just been completed, beginning with The Discoverers, which is about fulfillment in the sciences, the man's pursuit of the desire to know, The Creators, which is the story of heroes of the imagination, and then finally, we just recently published The Seekers, which is the history of the search for meaning, the question of man's effort to see what it all adds up to. If we know all these things and can make all these beautiful things, to what end? Why? And that book is a sort of a history of the why.
Could you explain the nature of your collaboration on these projects?
Well, I think Ruth has given the key to it. Beyond that, I think it's that it requires patience, which Ruth seems to have an infinite quality of, and it requires on the part of the subject who is being judged or criticized, respect for the editor. And Ruth has been, I've been very fortunate to have an in-house editor.
But it is special, though, you feel that as between the editor and the author, it's the author's last decision about any particular choice. But the writing is a lonely thing, and so aside from the sheer editing of manuscript, just the talking about the writing before it's done, talking about the subject, sometimes for years, is what I think helps build up not just our rapport, but also makes the book better. And we have one thing: when in doubt, leave it out.
Yes.
It's one of our mottos.
And I try to follow that advice.
And I remember when he did The Discoverers, which is a long book, as you know, after we had been through numerous revisions and talks and editings, the very last one, we took a mayonnaise jar and we had paper clips at every place where I had put any kind of question at all. These could be very little, almost commas kind of question, or a much more profound ones. But this was the last time round, and we put all the paper clips in the jar, and when we counted them, there were over 800. So that's how many decisions you make, and every writer, of course, knows that. And Dan is very good at taking corrections, I think, and suggestions.
Well, because I have a good editor.
Well,
that makes it easy to take the criticism, doesn't
but
it?
he does have the last word, and sometimes the author just sees something that he knows that's the way he wants it to be, and that's his book.
Dr. Boorstin, let me go to the writing process. Mrs. Boorstin described it as lonely. Is it lonely for you?
Well, not if you have the idea, and I have started my major works with a large idea. First, the story of American civilization, which were the 3 volumes I've mentioned, and then the story of human fulfillment, which is a sort of a human history. And you start with that large idea and then break it down into parts, and that keeps you focused for many years. About 30 years for the Americans and about 15 or 20 years for the 3 volumes most recently completed. And it's a great satisfaction to see the parts fit together.
Some people would have a difficult time imagining staying focused for 30 years.
Well,
He was doing a few other things at the same time,
I
of course.
did have some other responsibilities. So the most recent one was directing the Library of Congress, something which I enjoyed very much, and which put me in the world of books, and of course gave me access to lots of books, and all from the oldest to the most recent.
We certainly will come back to the Library of Congress, but let me stay with writing for just a minute. When is your best time of day to write?
Well, I think in the morning.
Early in the morning. I mean, 5 o'clock in the morning, Dan would go down to his study, and particularly the years when he was librarian, he'd work till 8 in his study, then he shut up the books, and closed up his typewriter, and of course went off to a completely different world of administration.
Is the morning a time when you find your thoughts clearest? Is that why it's easiest for you to write them?
But that's when I tend to do it before you get preoccupied with the activities and responsibilities of the day, and that's the way it's usually been.
Are you a disciplined writer? Are the sentences structured in your head by the time they get to paper?
No, I do a lot of rewriting. A lot of rewriting. I write on an manual Olympic typewriter. I have tried the word processor, but I don't feel at home with it. So I stay with my manual Olympic typewriter and then revise it. Ruth sees it, and I go revise it again and again, and then finally have somebody else type it, and I've been fortunate in having a good copyist who has copied the manuscript for these last volumes.
And that's when it goes on computer. I wanted to mention one thing, and that is Dan spends an enormous amount of time on outlines. He spends as long on an outline as some people spend on a book. So he works and works and works over the outline. You could almost publish a volume of his outlines. It's really true, isn't it, Dan? That it's
Well, yes,
very
I think the
important.
structure. For a big
Structure.
book, the outline is the most important thing, which provides for what you put in, and also, most important, what you leave out, which is just as important.
Is that Olympus still serving you well? Is it hard to find parts for these days?
No, we have a repair shop downtown that takes good care of it, and I feel at home with it. just as I feel at home with Ruth as my editor, I feel at home with that typewriter. So
Good thing.
Become
Don't
part of the
replace it.
family, it
that's
sounds like.
right. That's right.
And I have a similar one upstairs where I write directly on the typewriter.
Now, what size of chunks of your manuscript do you deliver? Do you wait until there's a completed section, or you do pages at a time to review?
Well, not pages, not page by page, but I do it chapter by chapter. Usually it's one chapter at a time, because the chapter should be coherent, and that's what makes it possible to have a coherent part of a book, and then to have a coherent book.
Over the years, I've read that you've worked with an editor at Random House who's pretty well known, Bob Loomis.
Yes.
What's his role versus what Mrs. Boorstin
I've
does?
been very fortunate in my editors, having an in-house editor and then another editor, Bob Loomis, who's been very sympathetic and constructive, and I've adored him, and he has been very helpful.
He has a very keen mind, and he zeroes in on inconsistencies that I might not see, didn't see, wouldn't see, perhaps.
Yeah.
And he also, he's just a very, very wise, good, incredible person. And
Yeah, that was
so
very
indebted
good
to
luck.
him.
I came to Random House. I was brought there by Bennett Cerf, who was one of the founders of the firm. And then after he died, why, I had another editor, Jess Stein, and then finally Bob Loomis, who has stayed with me and seems to understand what I can do and what I can't do and what I should try to do, which is just as helpful.
That's about 30 years, I think, close to 30 years that
A
Bob has
long
been with
time,
Dan.
yes.
And do you each understand the way the other thinks at this point? You and Bob Loomis?
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Do you find yourselves still
but,
having arguments over individual?
No, I welcome his criticism and usually take it.
He's very encouraging, too. He's a very positive attitude. And now and then he will have disagreed or wanted to throw out a chapter, and we always agree with him. He's always right. But one thing I wanted to mention was when Dan did his textbook, which has been a very wide-selling textbook of American history used in the 11th grades all over the United States, it was a really enormous grind to get that done. And he had another man working on it with him. And I took a shirt cardboard and some gold stars, and every time we finished a chapter, I wrote it in and gave us a gold star. And I think that encouraged us. I still have that shirt cardboard.
I also like the simple, straightforward title and a simple style. I remember when we were writing our American history textbook, which Ruth has mentioned, the publishers and others offered many fancy titles, such as the Romance of American History and that sort of thing, and we finally fixed on what we thought was the very best title, which is A History of the United States, and it's done very well.
And we had them check out the 200 main titles used in American history books, and no one had used the title A History of the United States.
The simplest one around.
Right, good title.
So we won with the simplest answer.
I want to spend some more time on your projects, but before we do that, can we talk about this?
Oh, absolutely.
This is Mrs. Boorstin's book, just out, and I'd like to reverse the questions. What role did you have in this?
Well, I was an admirer and a reader, and I've always encouraged Ruth to write poetry and been very fortunate. And her poetic sense is what has made her a good editor for me. She has a very lively imagination, and she reads almost everything that's most worth reading these days, and her reading is mostly fiction and in the world of arts, and I tend to read in nonfiction, especially biography.
Mrs. Boorstin, how long have you been writing poetry?
Since I was about 8 years old, I think. It always seemed the most important thing to me to do.
Will you describe your poetry to me?
Well, I think I tried to take an idea and state it succinctly to make the inexpressible accessible, if you want to put it that way, and intense. To me, my best poems are brief, intense ones that convey an emotion. And I also enjoy trying my hand at sonnets in different forms. Right now I'm trying to write a villanelle, which is a very difficult form, a fascinating form. And so I had a newspaper column for children for many years in a series of newspapers outside of Chicago. And the children wrote me stories and poems. It was called King Arthur's Court. And I had a column, and I used to be able to print my poems in my column. And so that was a great outlet for me for many years to
Ruth, why don't
print
you
poems.
give us the title poem, which is,
Well, all right, sure.
which I think is,
This is
you remember it, don't
Love
you?
Is Not Because is the name of the book. And the title poem is Love is not because, love is not although, not when will it be, or I told you so. Love is not perhaps, love is not until, not I think I may, but I know I will. That's
I like
the title
that,
poem.
don't you?
I do.
I'll just do one more then.
Please.
The next one. Such a sturdy thing, the heart. Squeeze it and it springs apart. Stamp it down and up it. Oh, gee, wait, let me just read this here. I'm sorry. Such a sturdy thing, the heart. Squeeze it and it flies apart. Stamp it down and up it springs. Silence it and still it sings. In the twinkling of an eye, ready for another try.
Humor also seemed important to you as I read
did.
this.
Well, you know, when I was raising 3 children and I was a busy faculty wife, I had to write poems that were short that I could keep in my head until I got around to paper and pencil to set them down. So I got in the habit of thinking in terms of sharp, presumably witty poems in 4 or 6 lines. And so when we came east here, and I was no longer faculty wife, but here involved in Washington, I tried sending them to the Wall Street Journal. That was way back in the 70s. And some of these ones that I had written, they liked. So I got in the habit of sending them maybe 5 or 7 a week, most weeks. And they would probably take 1 or 2 of them. And when they did, they paid me $10 a verse. And then they did a couple of books of wit and humor, and they did put
Give us an example, Ruth, of
Well,
some of those.
one, the invitations to which I'm harking are those that promise valet parking. But there are many, many of those kinds of verses.
Ruth is
They have to do with
witty and
with
able to condense
family.
her wit into a few lines. Give us a couple
And then-
more.
Well, here's one that's got a fatal question aspect. Who can afford to take his ease beneath the sword of Damocles? That was in the New York. But then many of them have to do with family and just general jokes.
And time, too.
Statistics confirm that urban and rural, these days it's singular to remain plural. And marriage is a game with present and future tenses. It could go by the name of troth and consequences. And
After all these years of working on books, is this the first one that has come off the presses with you as principal author?
that's true, and I really credit Dan because
About time, I think. Ruth's poems
Dan
were
encourages me to get them published, and when we sent them out, I didn't know whether it would be the serious or the light ones that the publisher would be most interested in. And this publisher, who had published a lovely book of Eugene McCarthy's poems, said, why don't you put them both together? And I said, well, how can you? The light ones are so light and the serious ones much more intense. And he said, well, it's you who are writing both of them. You're concerned with the same thoughts. Why don't you alternate sections? And so he said, cut up all the little poems and lay them on a table, walk around the table, and you'll find that they'll fall into categories, and you select them. So I did, and it worked remarkably well. So there's one on family and on death and on marriage, divorce, and I was surprised that it did work that well.
Now, I know you've got so much of yourself invested in all these books, but was the feeling different when the first one of these was delivered to you?
It was amazing because it was sort of a crypto thing that as a poet, I was certainly not widely known, and many people didn't know I wrote verses or poems at all. And suddenly here it is, an actual concrete thing. And I had great pleasure in doing readings, and people seemed to enjoy the book, partly because I am a rhymer. Words to me fall into rhyme from the time I was a little girl, so that people, I think, like rhyme, and they don't get as much of it these days in the magazines as perhaps they would like.
I wanted to show our viewers that you, in fact, dedicated it for Dan.
Well, I certainly did. He's dedicated his books for me so long. You bet I did.
Are all of your books dedicated to Ruth?
Yes, I think so. Well,
No,
I
we
did
dedicated one to our grandchildren.
one to our grandchildren, but others, the rest of them were dedicated
And
to
the
Ruth.
first one-
She was dedicated to the book, so it was only appropriate. The book should be dedicated to her, seemed to me.
From the very beginning, were you also able to give her a collaborator's line? Or is that something the publisher was concerned about?
The publisher didn't interfere at all with the acknowledgments.
Well, I'm not really a collaborator on most of the books. I don't think an editor is a collaborator.
You don't?
I don't. I think that the editor is to bring forth the flower and the main thought and essence of what the writer is doing, and he certainly is not the same as a collaborator. The thing that I marvel about with Dan is he takes suggestions so warmly and encouragingly and welcomingly. Sometimes he comes up with I'm thinking of an article, and I look at it and I say, no, it's just not right. And he goes down as if we were a beginning writer, writes a whole new piece, comes up, and I look at it and say, there we are. That's what it should be. And sometimes he comes up and says, this is no good, but you might as well look at it. And I look at it and I say, it's great. This is just exactly right. Don't change a word. So it works both ways, and it's been a very happy marriage of mine.
And one must remember that, contrary to what many authors believe, the author is not the best judge of what he said. It's only the reader who knows what the author has said. And that's where the good editor, the perceptive editor, like Ruth, can help.
Where did this is a question for both of you, where did this love of books and writing come from, do you think? Do you have an influence in your life that you can hold as responsible?
No, I can't be. We had, my father used to collect books, and I remember very well the living room bookshelf, which had books, had all the English classics in it. And my father was somewhat of a victim for book salesmen, so when there were sets of books like the writings of Robert Ingersoll or the other collections of the great and famous, well, my father was a ready purchaser, and he would take them home, and I would read in them, and that was a great blessing and a stimulus too.
I think at college, and particularly Harvard, stimulated you.
And then when I was at college, I had the good fortune to have a great teacher, F.O. Matheson, who wrote about American history and American literature, whose great work was American Renaissance, and who was responsible for introducing T.S. Eliot as a writer in this country. And that was it was a great good fortune for me that I had Matty, F.O. Matheson, as my teacher. He was very sympathetic and very encouraging, and he was my guide when I wrote my honors thesis, which was fortunately on Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which I hope you'll read and which I hope our other viewers will turn to, was an inspiration to me, and was an example of the fact that great history must also be great literature. And that's been my hope and my effort, with Ruth's assistance and with that of Bob Loomis too.
And I think at Oxford you got very careful, critical reading from your tutors.
Yes.
Who really taught you to write and rewrite. And I think you learned a lot at Oxford from what you've told me.
Yes, and you must be willing to rewrite, which I have become so accustomed to that I don't think I've written anything until I've gone over it and revised it several times.
Ruth Borston, what about yourself? Who interested you in books?
Well, my home was full of very active readers. My mother had been a teacher, and my father, who was an engineer, and in those days they didn't do much literature and engineering at universities. But at home, my mother had fired him up on reading, and he read a great many biographies. And we lived next door to Will Durant and Ariel in Great Neck, growing up for 10 years. And Will Durant was a great inspiration, sitting in his living room, and he said, I'm going to write for 40 years, 5 years a book. I'm going to write 8 books, which he did. But as I grew up, I did read a lot, and a lot of poetry of the Ernest St. Vincent Millay, Sarah Teasdale, the poets that were popular in those days.
And I think the great incentive is to read, to write, to learn. And that's the great benefit that I've had in addition to Ruth's editorship, learning from everything I've written. For example, I've learned a great deal from writing the 3rd volume in this last trilogy, The Seekers, and was led back to reading the Greek philosophers and others, and that led me on to new paths of reflection. But you must write to learn. That's the way I feel.
I'd like to learn a little bit about your time at the Library of Congress. You spent more than a decade there. What do you think your legacy from your tenure is?
Well, it's not for me to say. I think that the Library of Congress is a great institution and has had many people shaping it, including its admirable staff. And they're the people who are responsible for making it a great public service institution. So I don't know that...
well, the Center for the Book.
Well, there were a number of innovations. Ruth has mentioned one institution called the Center for the Book, which I was responsible for with Ruth's encouragement, and that has flourished and has outposts all over the country, in fact, all over the world.
Would you explain what it does for people that aren't familiar?
When I came to the library, it was a time when mechanics was taking over from the book, and this program itself is an example of the temptations and the opportunities, the risks too. I thought it was a good thing to find a way to remind people of the book, which is the great wealth of the Library of Congress, of course. And I started this institution, which then was taken up by CBS, which had a series of programs called Read More About It, which was a way of encouraging people to take off from what they saw on the screen or in the movies and read more about it, learn more.
All the public libraries in the country had a list, isn't that true, of 3 or 4 books which they had available and which they publicized locally,
yes,
so that all over the country people watching the program could go to their local library.
So we tried to treat television as not as the enemy of the book, but as the ally and the co-conspirator, inducing people to read books. And it's worked out very well. And I've been lucky in having an excellent person, John Cole, who was one of the first people to manage the centers and spread them around, and that's been very successful.
Well, John is
something I'm very pleased with.
He's still at it.
Yes, he's still at it, and there are more new centers for the book being established
in
all the
almost
time.
every state and in a couple of foreign countries. There's a Center for the Book promoting books. Now, my way of promoting books, I'm involved with Reading is Fundamental, RIF, which believes that you get books in the hands of children and that if they have them, they'll read them and learn to love reading, as was my own good fortune. So, and of course, RIF does work with the Center for the Book, but the Center for the Book has been an enormous stimulus for all kinds of conferences, and now at the library, many of the cultural poetry readings, things like that go on under the aegis of the Center for the Book.
Dr. Boorstin, with all the technology that's happening today, with all the computers, are you confident that this form will be around for as long as...
Yes, I am, certainly.
He really is.
The new technology does not displace the old. It simply has a new niche for itself, and that's the way I think the book will remain as our enduring messenger from the past and to the future. So that I think it's a mistake to think that the television is going to displace the book. Not at all. It will simply increase the temptations to read books, and that's what we've used the Center for the Book as an agent for.
If we had the chance to walk along the shelves of your own personal library, what kinds of books would we find there?
Well, a great variety. I don't know that I've indexed, my books are indexed, and I have a card catalog so that I can find them when I want. And I use the Library of Congress system when, I have access to these books, and I've enjoyed all of them. I think I've tried to, and I try to, Ruth encourages me to widen my taste and reach out for more fiction and poetry. And I find that the current works of fiction, especially biography, are a great temptation. I'm enjoying now Scott Berg's Life of Lindbergh, which I never thought would have been as interesting as it is, but it's full of vivid and enriching detail, and that's what makes a great biography.
Daniel does adore the Oxford English Dictionary, and he leaves a marker in every time he's used it. And the book is a sea of markers there. He starts by looking up the derivation of a word, and it sometimes is a very good way to get insight into the idea that he's seeking for. But he does have 4,000 or 5,000 or more books around in that study.
And I love reference books, too, as Ruth points out. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, is especially enriching because you can discover meanings of the word that you never imagined. And that's what I find most enriching and eye-opening.
You have as many as 5,000 books in your own collection?
Oh, yes, more than that, many more than that. And we continue to buy books and to enjoy them.
Can either of you remember a day without a book? Does it ever happen to you?
Well, it happened to us on the Zugspitze.
What was that?
When
Yes.
we had gone up the Zugspitze outside of Munich, up in the mountains, intending to go back that night, and we missed the train. So there we were, no pajamas, no books, and that's when Dan decided he should move from American history to world history to broaden his horizons. That was really when we made that decision.
Right,
That he was thinking of what he should do for the next book.
Suppose we'd had a book. What do you think we would have done?
No trilogy with
no
you'd had a book.
trilogy, one trilogy less. But it was a very good decision.
But are books a part of every day for you?
Yeah.
Of course.
You have them
really
all
say
over the
so.
house in
Of
various
course, of
stations?
Well, we
Yes,
do.
of
We're
course.
very interested in art, and of course the National Gallery of Art with its marvelous catalogs and exhibits. Just now we have the catalog for the Sargent Show, and before that, of course, the Van Gogh, which is
Never a day without a book.
What about your children? Did you pass on this interest to your sons?
all too well, because two of them are writers. And,
Yes, they become writers. They've all.
We're very pleased and proud, and the third one actually writes in connection with his business. But two of them are out in Hollywood, movie writers. They've each written at least one novel. One of our sons a couple. One of them has one just finished now. And so it's very exciting, and we're very proud. And now we can see the next generation with a granddaughter, Julia, at Princeton, who's very active on the newspaper. And
She's writing, too.
and the other kids in high school and so forth. So that's very satisfying.
Would you say that for young people there are some must-reads, some things that they absolutely have to get to in order to expand their scope of
I think they should read the books that interest them, and that's what will cultivate an interest in literature, is reading books that you're interested in, not just because you're required to or expected to. And that would be, well, there's no limit. It can be nonfiction, it can be biography, it can be folklore, myth, anything.
And you said that you are trying to expand your tastes, but if you go to your first interests, what are the books you'll pick up?
Well, I don't know. When I remember back in Tulsa, I was much interested in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which I found entrancing and still do.
But also, I think that biography is Dan's main love, and this has been a great year or two for biographies. You know, the ones on Rockefeller. You've reading.
Mentioned Lindbergh.
And I think there is a real need for biography, too, because the rise of the social sciences has emphasized the large impersonal causes, economic forces and ideology and geography and so on, so that more than ever we need the nuance of the individual life, the peculiar accidental circumstances that produce the unexpected.
Well, for someone who's just completed 2 survey works, it's interesting that you're suggesting we need the nuance of the individual life.
That's right.
But the survey works include the individual facts about people. It's based on Dan's books that are called the seekers, discoverers, not the fact of discovery, but the people doing it.
That's right.
Isn't that right, Dan?
That's Ruth's quite right. Again, she goes to the heart of the matter.
So they're very rich. The creators is rich in the lives and influences upon their lives of artists, musicians, and so forth. That's what makes it such good, lively reading. It is about people.
And my book about American civilization is called The Americans. Then the parts of it are about experience. You see, I believe in experience, in the shaping force of experience, the colonial experience, the national experience, the democratic experience, and also the fact that there's no way of delimiting the forces of history, the nuances of what people think of as trivia. There's no such thing as trivia in history. Advertising and all the little things that we encounter, those are the shapers of our consciousness and our experience.
When you were working on the book, The National Experience, I remember I was trying to clean up his office a little bit, and on his desk there was a Coca-Cola bottle and paper cup and a piece of glass and so forth, and I said that I was going to throw those away, and he said, "Don't touch those. Those are my bibliography." Those were all the things that he was thinking about, which didn't ordinarily enter into ordinary histories.
I wanted to ask you, while we're talking about the role of individuals, about this individual, Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Someone, when you ever have anything to do with the Library of Congress, you learn had a very special role to play.
Yes.
What should people know about Thomas Jefferson and his contributions to American literature, reading, books, and the love of books in this country?
Well, I would be glad if they would read The Lost World of Thomas Jefferson, of course, but also I think that the Declaration of Independence is one way of learning about the scope of Jefferson's thought. He, of course, was the principal author, and
well, the architecture down at Monticello, you learn a lot about Jefferson. Have you been down?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's a very good place to go to get the sense of the versatility and breadth of interest of Jefferson.
Would there have been a Library of Congress without him?
Well, yes, certainly there was, of course, but he contributed he left his books to the library, and
the first 6,000 books in the Library of Congress were Jefferson's, weren't they?
Right. And they added, and that enriched the library enormously, and he was an example of a person who saw ideas and books as part of experience. He was the president of the American Philosophical Society, which was an institution that gathered all sorts of information about butterflies and minerals and all sorts of everything that could shape one's feeling and thinking. So I think Jefferson is an inspiration to us to seize the opportunities of our time and our place, which he certainly did.
How much time do you spend at the Library of Congress now as librarian emeritus?
Well, it varies. I have an office there, and I try to help in any way I can, and try to encourage people to leave their papers to the library, and advise the librarian, the excellent librarian, James Billington, on any questions about the library. So I don't know. I would say I'm there the better part of perhaps 3 days a week.
Dan was active with the Ralph Ellison papers, and just now they've acquired Etta St. Vincent Millay's main papers. They have the best collection of that. I don't know
all those enrich the library and open the past to the future.
I just finished reading Sylvia Jukes Morris' book, her recent biography of the Connecticut Congresswoman, and she's dedicated, Claire Boothe Luce, both of your names are mentioned in her acknowledgments. Do you work to support the work of other writers? Do you actively encourage them to use the library and start new projects?
I try to encourage them, yes. In that case, I was responsible for her doing the work because I was a great friend and admirer of Claire Luce. And she was a friend of ours, and we used to stop and visit her as we went to Japan, where I went on several lecture tours. And she had a house in Hawaii, and we would stop and stay with her for a few days. And she was a very enriching, lively person, full of enthusiasm,
a lot of fun.
especially for books and literature.
And she was reluctant to have a biography done, and Sylvia was determined to do it. And it was in this house at a dinner table that she decided, with our urging, to let this young woman, she was then a young woman, now time has passed because she's worked very long on that book. And so she did allow her biography to be done. And of course, the papers were at the library, and Dan got many more papers.
And of course, Claire was a very lively and inspiring person, and I hope that her biographer will get that across. That she was a lively person with wide sympathies and able to inspire people.
And a spiritual person in many ways, but maybe an unfulfilled one too. It was hard to be that able a woman back in those days, when there was so much more limited scope for people. But after all, she was an ambassador. She wrote The Women, which right now is playing. There's never a day when that play is not playing someplace in the world. And so it's important to realize she was not just a beautiful social woman married to Henry Luce, but herself would have been these days an enormous powerhouse as a political and intellectual figure. And it's a mistake to see her as being more of a, she was even described on television as a social climber.
Run for Senate,
yes,
you
she
think?
might have run a senator from New York, who knows, or Connecticut.
Dr. Boorstin, what role or how did your life change as a writer after the Pulitzer?
Not at all.
Not at all?
No, I wouldn't think so, no. I didn't think it was, I don't think that sort of thing is what makes a writer. People who live for the prizes are not people who do important work in literature. Those are accidents, and it's very accidental what books win those prizes, and you mustn't attach too much importance to them, even though the public always calls you a Pulitzer winner, but that's not what makes your books worth reading.
It will be the first line of your obituary, you know that, if a Pulitzer Prize winning. But we actually were getting onto the plane to go to California, where Dan was giving a lecture, and he just checked back with his secretary, marvelous Janet Chase, his assistant, and she said he'd won it. And when we went back on TWA, and I told Dan, and I told the stewardess, and she had drinks on the house. So that was maybe...
The only time we've ever known any airline to give drinks on the house.
Did your books sell?
That's one of the good effects of the Pulitzer.
There you go. Did your books sell more afterward? Is that one benefit, that more people are drawn to them?
I really don't know. I don't know. But they've sold quite well. And,
I think the Book of the Month Club is, as an American historian, Dan had written, after the Americans, the other books, and were widely known as, he'd won the Bancroft and the Parkman, which in American history terms almost more than the Pulitzer, although less known to the public. But I think when the Book of the Month Club, which the Discoverers was, that was an enormous push, and that book sold out completely in Washington. So the bookstores were coming to us and saying, do you have any extra copies we can sell? Because it was at Christmas time. Yeah. And since then, the books have sold very widely.
And they've been widely translated, which is encouraging, because you reach people you could never speak to, you know. There have been more than 25 languages are the sources of my books now.
I wanted to show the French version.
Yes, that's a very attractive edition.
Book with illustrations.
And do you find when you travel that having your books translated has made a difference in?
Well, yes, people sometimes have read them. And in Japan, for example, my books have been very popular in Japanese, and one of my books, very little book, has been especially widely translated and influential, and that's a book called The Image, A History of Pseudo-Events, which was which invented the phrase pseudo-events and popularized it, and which has had a considerable, you may remember the opening passage of that, a woman is is pushing a baby carriage through the park, and a friend comes up to her and says, "My, what a beautiful baby you have there." She says, "That's nothing. You should see his picture." And that is the theme of the image, the pseudo-event, the thing which is made to represent something being more influential even than the fact.
But I just wanted to mention that when we traveled in China, two men came up and said, "May we take your picture at some university we were at with Dan?" And Dan said, "Yes, but why do you want that?" And they said, "We're the ones who translated the Americans into Chinese." And Dan said, "But it's not in Chinese." And they said, "Oh, yes, it is." And of course, in those days, China was translating these books without permission. I'm happy to say that with the last book, The Seekers, two different Chinese publishers are competing for publication, each making an offer in legal, international
what
ways,
these
doing
men
it
should have
correctly.
said is, which they didn't quite say, is, "We are your pirates," which is what they were. But
nonetheless, having these ideas imported into China at that
It was
time.
great. Yeah, it was good.
Well,
Perhaps
you
worth
hope the
piracy?
ideas are imported. You
I
hope
think
so.
later on, the U.S. government bought about 5,000 copies of Dan's book and distributed them to key people because it was about the United States, you know.
Well, we're talking about titles. You mentioned that you always like to go for the clear, concise title. This one's a little different as a title. Cleopatra's Nose.
Yes, well, that was a suggestive title, and it was meant to imply the importance of the unexpected, the unpredictable. No one would have thought that the shape of Cleopatra's nose would have something to do with determining the course of Western history,
What did
including the
Pascal
British.
say? Remember?
I'm trying to
That
remember.
He said if Cleopatra's nose had been half an inch longer, the face of the world would have been different. So
That's right.
that was,
That's right.
and actually that title seems to have caught on a lot.
It does catch your attention.
Yeah.
Among all these, I've read before when interviewers have asked you, "Do you have a favorite?" You always demur and say, "My favorite's the next one." But after all this work, there must be something among this that you...
No, I don't think so. I think I'm always, my favorite is my next book, which I'm now working on. I'm working on a collection of essays which will be out within a year or so, and which I will probably call Risks of Literature, which is a subject that I know a little bit about, and which other people will have had some experience with. I like that, the element of uncertainty, the element of expectation, of not knowing how it will turn out. That's what the experience you have with a book.
Do you have a favorite among them?
Well, I was just thinking, I think the first volume of The Americans, A Colonial Experience, Dan had worked so hard on that, and it followed another book, The Genius of American Politics, which was widely known but in the profession. But that particular book, I think when Dan mailed it off, the final copy, there were really tears in his eyes. That was the beginning of what was to be such a large project, as he said, for 30 years on the Americans. And in one sense, The Colonial Experience was, I think, your first really major reaching out book.
It was the first part of a trilogy.
And it was the first part of a trilogy.
The first trilogy.
But also The Discoverers, Dan had to plan his time so carefully, getting up so early in the morning when he was putting in a day of administration, and worked so long on the outlines of that book. And then at the end, we threw out 10 chapters because not that they weren't good chapters, but they didn't belong in the book. The structure of the book, I think, is one thing that doesn't make it so effective, the very concept of what he was trying to do. So I suppose maybe The Discoverers would be another one.
Well, it's had an appeal. It's been translated, I think, into more than 25 languages, I think, and I meet people all over the world who've read it, which is encouraging.
We wrote one children's book, The Landmark History of the American People, and that is still selling quite well, even though it's illustrated with black and white illustrations, not necessarily the most popular these days. But that book is still doing well after all these years.
And another version of that is published by a very interesting publisher who published books for parents to use teaching children at home, the Sunlight Publishers. And that book has done well in that edition, too. So.
Well, we mentioned publishers. What are your views about what's happening in the publishing business now with consolidation, purchase of American long-held names by foreign companies?
I think the great American publishers and the ones who have had the great influence are publishers who had the power of a personality. Bennett Cerf was responsible really for Random House, and Alfred Knopf for Knopf, and those personalities who had a love of books and a taste for books shaped those, would in the long run determine the power and influence of those publishers. And that's not the balance sheet, but the influence of the person and the unique character of those publications that determines the power of a publisher.
It's sort of scary when Simon & Schuster, this enormous publisher, is something like 2% of the total corporation. I don't know, Gulf and Western and on, to get down to the firm. And now Random House, of course, taken over by this enormous Bertelsmann firm and Doubleday combining with them. It's a scary thing, and it puts the bottom line too much in the forefront as what makes a decision about what gets published, or at least it could. I think writers worry about that.
It makes you value more than ever the power of the author. That's what I believe in. Well, I believe in the power of the author.
But does it encourage more authors or prevent more authors from getting their words published?
I don't know, but it certainly doesn't prevent the author. You can't prevent the author. If he has something he wants to do, he will do it. And that's what I've found most fulfilling.
In fact, does the rise of all the small publishing houses portend well for people who have something to say?
Well, yes, I'm in favor of small publishers. There's a small publisher who published Ruth's.
Yes, the Lone Oak
poems.
Press
The
out
Lone Oak
in
Press
Minnesota.
specializes it's in Minnesota, Red Wing, Minnesota.
But it is true that this giant marketing also of the bookstores, which do favor the books, and when they are large publications, they get special discounts and all these things we know about. And I think it is very dangerous to put the small bookseller out of business, which is certainly happening, although new ones come along all the time.
Well, we all need a small bookshop. We have one here, the Cleveland Park Bookshop, which we enjoy and where we buy books. And I think that that's the bookseller, the knowledgeable bookseller is the person who enriches people's lives with books.
Our time is just about finished with you. Let me ask, now that you aren't going to a very busy job at the Library of Congress quite so regularly, and you have a bit more time, one might guess, on your hands, are you varying your routines at all for writing and creating your next book?
Well, I don't start quite so early in the morning.
A little later in the morning.
A little later in the morning,
I'm
yes,
glad to
that's
say.
right. But it's still the general. You can't change your method of writing after so many years and having tried it out in so many books.
We have a country place which is close here, just within an hour in Maryland, and we can come and go to that more frequently now that he's not tied down with as many official duties.
It's in Maryland. It's directly facing southern Maryland, directly facing Mount Vernon, and we call it Mount Vernon View. And we can sit on our porch there, or sit in our dining room and look out and see where George Washington lived.
And that's an inspiration.
And that is inspiring too.
Do you think you'll both always write? You think you'll always have something more to say?
Well, I don't know. We hope so.
I think
We hope so. Hope so.
Danny will always have more to say.
We hope so.
But I think he'll do it cautiously in the sense of planning out that outline before he plunges in. Although one charming essay he wrote about his father, he just sat at the typewriter and wrote it with no outline or plan at all, and it comes through very well. So maybe he'll do a little more permanent, more personal reminiscence, perhaps.
That of interest? More personal reminiscence?
I don't know. I think you have to beware of writing a biography without any content. And I regret to say some of my acquaintances who had experience in the Foreign Service have written so-called biographies or memoirs that have very little to say except the people they dined with and where and when. But that's not my intention.
So we're not likely to see the Borston biography, autobiography?
I don't think so.
But I think the poetry of life, the prose of life tends to drive out the poetry. So I hope that we'll have the poetry of life in our life for a long time to come.
Well, and Ruth has certainly helped us have it. Hasn't she?
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was delightful spending an hour with you.
Thank you.
Fun to talk to you.
Daniel Boorstin's most recent book, The Seekers, was published by Random House last year. It represents the final installment in a 3-volume history of human fulfillment. For more information about The Seekers, click onto their website at randomhouse.com. Ruth Boorstin's book of poetry, Love Is Not Because, is published by Lone Oak Press. For more information, you can write the publisher at 1412 Bush Street, Red Wing, Minnesota, 55066.